Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about the elite units in the Solar Auxilia army for Horus Heresy, the Age of Darkness. This is part 4 of a multi-part review of the Solar Auxilia faction, so please do tune into those other episodes as well and check out the other units that I've reviewed. In this video, we are going to talk about the Veletaris Tercio, so the elite Solar Auxilia infantry. We're going to talk about the Medicae Section, so the equivalent of Space Marine apothecaries, and we're going to take a look at the very interesting and cool Charonite Ogryns units, or Charonite Ogryns units, if you want to pronounce it like that you can also take in this army that have some pretty cool Forge World models as well. But before we do those things, if you enjoy the content, please do like and subscribe. Leave me any feedback in the comments below, and also as well, don't forget to join our Discord community, which is linked in the video description. And now on with the show. The Auxilia Veletaris Tercio is the core tertio for elite choices in the Auxilia army. So you can take 0 to 1 command sections in this tertio, 1 to 3 storm sections, so you've got to have a minimum of 1, and 0 to 1 Vanguard section. They've got an elite human stat line, so weapon skill, ballistic skill, and initiative 4, strength and toughness 3, but they've only got 1 attack, unlike some elites. They got leadership 6 and a 4+ save. They come with reinforced void armor, so it's still a 4+ save, but it gives them the heavy trait, so they're getting that reroll against blasts. Now, as opposed to other infantry in this army, these guys are not close order, so they're not advancing in a line firing their las rifles. They are, fighting more loosely and a bit more like elites. They can be troops and line and get access to Aevos lighters, so a flying transport if you take the solar pattern cohort as well, which is quite interesting. The Veletaris Storm section is the main unit in this tertio, so it's 90 points for 10 models. Extra models are 8 points each. Now they come with Volkite charges, they've got the stats we've just discussed. You can change those Volkite charges for Storm Axes if you want to. So these are basically slightly upgraded power axes. They're +2 strength, which is strength 5 on these guys. AP 2, they're two-handed and murderous strike 6. So that's quite an interesting and powerful weapon. The downside with it is they're only 1 base attack, which means, 2 on the charge, 1 not on the charge. If they're not charging, despite having such a great weapon, these guys aren't going to do an awful lot most of the time, and they are going to go second as well to even basic tactical marines who will punch a lot of them to death. They can take heavy void armor on the sergeant, so that'll upgrade 1 guy to a 3+ save, so that's 10 points, and compared to Artificer armor, there's a big difference going from 3 to 2 compared to going from 4 to 3. It's probably not worth taking most of the time, this. Although, if you've got some points spare or if you've made this unit quite big, it could be worth it. You can get pistol upgrades on the Prime, which is similar to other infantry tertios, but because they're replacing Volkite, they're free. So you could opt for a needle pistol, maybe for free on that guy. As usual, most of the pistol option's not really worth it, but the needle option giving you pinning potentially is kind of okay. But summing all that up, these guys, when you look at that in totality, they've got some decent weapon options. They're just very expensive. 90 points for 10 models is nearly as expensive as Space Marines. And although Space Marines have only got bolters, these guys have got Volkite charges, which are a bit better. These guys are so fragile compared to a Space Marine. And, they've got less leadership. They need to be buffed to get that leadership, etc. They're just very expensive. The axes on them are pretty good. Like I do like the axe profile, but +5 points per model those axes cost. So that brings this up to be an 140 point unit. And 140 points with those base attacks and their fragility is just way too expensive. So that the base cost of these guys plus the axe upgrade on top just makes them very difficult to consider. I mean, I would say this unit is probably like 15 points overcosted, maybe a little bit more. Volkite charges in general throughout the game, everywhere you can take them, are actually a pretty expensive option, and generally they're not very good because Deflagrate just isn't that good. Strength 5 is good, but only being AP 5 limits its usefulness against most things you shoot at. So Volkite charges are overcosted, which I think is the problem for these guys. If anything, the Storm Axes at least should have been a free upgrade. Like if these guys were 90 points with Storm Axes, I would definitely want to try some of them out in the army to give it a little bit of an option. Also for the coolness and the variation, but from a tabletop point of view, it would be viable. But they're just too expensive, especially when you've got the companions, which we talked about in the HQ unit review, which fulfill the sort of elite unit criteria, they just do it better. Companions are very well costed for their 2 wounds each. Same weapon skill and BS as these guys. 2 attacks each. They can get power weapons. They can get plasma guns. They're just better at everything that these guys want to do. So unfortunately, this unit just isn't very good because it's too expensive. If you do want to use this unit, though, the Stormax ones are completely off the table for me just because of cost. The Volkite ones aren't too bad. As long as you're not trying to make an army out of them, a unit or 2 of these in your army to give you some variety, different models to paint, maybe because you want to do the elite cool factor, or maybe you want to run the Solar Tercio and, get some extra line units into your army. They're excusable. They're just, not very good. Like I say, they're probably overcosted by like 15, 20 points for what they do, which isn't awful, just not great either. And the Veletaris command section, which is, as usual with these units, similar to the Storm section, just suffers from the same problems magnified. So these guys are 90 points for 5 models. 5 toughness 3, 1 wound guys for 90 points. I don't know what this is all about. Now, the first prime in that unit has got leadership 8, which is, a little buff, and at least differentiates them from the Storm section, as opposed to the Rifle Tercio, where the command section really has no differentiators at all. It's got the command Vox option, obviously, as well, but you're probably going to want to get that leadership from HQ units with legates and that kind of stuff. The whole squad can have power weapons, which is quite interesting. But again, the other problem is so can companions, and they do it better, and they are well costed. Like, companions get, for not many more points than this, get double wounds and double attacks on every model, and a refractor field, and they come with melter bombs. The difference is just crazy. These are just outclassed by companions in every way, effectively. And even, whereas the Storm section are, like, forgivable with Volkites, these guys are just really, really bad. So if you are going to run a Veletaris Tercio, just skip the command section altogether, which again is a shame because you want to take them. You want to have this command structure in place in your auxiliary army, but they've given us the option to take 0, and we're probably going to take it if it means the army is a bit more playable. Now, in comparison to the Storm section and Storm command section, the Vanguard section, which are the fire support part of the elites, are actually really well costed. So these are 90 points for 10 models, with the ballistic skill 4, etc. But they come with rotor cannons or heavy flamers for free. What a difference your good weapons not costing 5 points per model makes. So most of their options are basically the same as the Storm squad, but they get these 10 guns for nothing, and that's very cost effective. Compared to the equivalent Space Marine tactical support squad, they would get 5 Marines with rotor cannons for 110 points. So you're getting double the guns, double the men, worse stats per man for less points. And that's probably where the Storm section should be as well. Equally, you can give them heavy flamers, and I'm a big fan of flamers in this game. If you listen to much of my content, 10 of these guys in an Aurochs with heavy flamers, going to put out some damage. They're really good. Now, unfortunately, these are limited to 1 unit in the Tercio. So it means that you've got to take a Storm section for every one of these you want to take in your army. And because we're trying to limit the number of Storm sections that we're taking as well, you probably want to take like a 1-on-1 mix. Now, if you do that, that still makes these come out overall decent. These guys are really aggressively costed. Storm sections with Volkite are a little bit too expensive, really. So if you take 1-on-1 as an elite choice, then I think that's still quite a good buy overall for your army. And again, as with everything, adds a bit of variety to the models you're painting, adds something different to do on the tabletop, which is pretty cool, and I think definitely worth considering doing. You can either run them as just separate units and just forget the Tercio rules, or you could probably get away with taking the rotor cannons with the Volkites and keeping them together. That's a pretty mean return fire if you do have to use your return fire reaction with those guys as well. So I think these are... The Vanguard section is great, but unfortunately it comes with the Storm section. But the sum total of it is playable, which is better than being not playable at all, and is still a valid option for the army. Next, we got the Medicae section. So these are very similar to apothecaries in the way they work. You buy 1 unit with a bunch of models in, and then you assign them out to your units before the game starts. They're 15 points. Again, they've got that weapon skill, ballistic skill 4, strength toughness 3, 1 wound profile, and they grant a 6+ feel no pain to their unit with their auto Medicus. So they've also got a few upgrades, pistol and melee, which you're not going to take, but they can bring a needle pistol for 2 points, which is kind of nice to have a guy in your unit that can throw out a potential pin. So let's look at some maths. Are these guys worth it or not? Well, 10 riflemen is 65 points, assuming you buy them a Vox Interlock. So you're paying 6.5 points per wound. Now, the medic is going to mean the enemy has to wound you an average of 2 extra times to kill that unit. Plus, he's got his own wound as well. So for 15 points, you're getting 19.5 points worth of wounds. A little bit more, actually, since he gets to feel no pain on his own wound as well. So is he efficient? Yes, he is. And as the unit size goes up, when you go to 15, 20-man units potentially, he gets way more worth it, which is great. The downside to that is with toughness 3 models, you're not always going to get your feel no pain. So sometimes you might just be getting his 1 extra wound that he brings because he's a body. And the other downside with apothecaries that and Medicae that people often forget is, whilst they can be very efficient in terms of wounds per point, if that unit is not being shot at, it's not doing a lot at all. So that's the thing you've got to balance. You know, you could argue on defensive efficiency for putting one of these in every unit in your army, but that would be inefficient because when the enemy's not shooting at them, they're pretty much sitting there doing nothing. So I think in bigger units in your army, these can be pretty worth it. Or if you're running elite units like companions and that kind of things, these are also definitely worth it as well. Very much worth it in that case. Or if you've got a unit in your army that is more likely to be shot first, like if you have got 1 Veletaris Vanguard Section in the army with 10 rotor cannons, that's probably going to be a better target than all your las rifle guys. That might be a place to put a Medicae as well. So these guys are pretty good. I would definitely recommend using them. Again, like with most things in this army, you could paint a lot of infantry with las rifles, and painting a few things different, giving your army some variation on the table, is a nice thing to do, but even better when they fulfill a role. One thing to be aware of, in a 10-man unit, this guy won't fit in an Aurochs because Aurochs only have a capacity of 10, compared to things like Rhinos, which get 12, so they can bring like character and an apothecary. Aurochs are only 10. So if you're going to mount the squads in transports that aren't Dracosans, the Medicae can't come along. So just bear that in mind. Another thing to think about too is if you're not buffing the leadership on your squads in some way, which I would always recommend, and I really do rate Reborn cohorts very highly for that reason. But if you're not, these guys will be worse as well, because a lot of the time your squads will run away before all the wounds are done to them. But if you are taking those Reborn, or you have just got that Command Vox and them Legates around to make everything leadership 10, you know, you've got a few guys that are stubborn as well from your Legate maybe, or from using the command sections. These guys are even better because your opponent's forced to kill them all to get them off the table. So overall for Medicae, definitely worth taking, definitely worth considering. Just don't spend too many points on putting them in too many places, because a lot of the time they will sit there and not be useful while you're not being shot at. Now, randomly in the middle of the Elite section, there's a special character as well, and there's only one in the book, which is kind of weird. Surgeon Primus Aevos Jovan. This guy is presumably in a book. I'm sure you guys can tell me all about his narrative that I'm not aware of. He's 60 points, and he can buy up to 3 orderlies for an extra 5 points each. He's got bitter duty. He can't be the warlord. To all intents and purposes, he sits behind your guys and does operations on them when they get wounded. He basically gives like a super feel no pain within 12 inches. So when a model gets removed, you roll a dice. On a 2 to 5, it stays alive with 1 wound. On a 6, it stays alive with all of its wounds. And on a 1, it stays alive, but only until the end of the turn. So it always keeps the models alive, which is great. And it doesn't work like feel no pain. You know, it doesn't matter what they've been hit by, which is great. But it only works in the movement or shooting phase, so it doesn't work in melee. He also as well gives -1 leadership to all friendly and enemy units within 12 inches. Now, he can't be shot at unless the enemy is within 12 inches, so he's nice and safe if he's far away. But if you do use him to somehow try to debuff the enemy's leadership, you might be able to do that for a turn if you can get him close enough to do it, but he's going to die immediately afterwards. So it's not like you can really use this aura offensively. Mostly this is just going to debuff your own troops when he's there. And -1 leadership in this army is not, you know, a good thing. So given the troops he's usually going to be saving, which is at best a companion, maybe with a plasma gun for 22 points. He will make his points back over the course of the battle if what he's doing is saving elites, but if he's saving things like storm sections or riflemen, 60 points plus an extra 15 for the orderlies. So the orderlies let you do user's ability an extra time and then you take the model off, like maximum of once a turn. He's probably not going to make his points back over the course of a battlefield, over the course of the battle. And even if he does, it's not going to be by much. And while he's doing it, he's giving you -1 leadership, which can wipe out any advantage he might have given you if even one unit just fails a morale test because of it. So overall, I would say this guy's a pretty fun unit, and you definitely could consider using him. Like if you're playing Reborn cohorts and everything's got leadership 11, and you want him to save a bunch of plasma companions from dying, it could be worth thinking about in that situation. But most of the time, I think he's a fun unit, and he's mostly skippable. You mostly don't need to think about him. If you want to make your unit a bit tougher, you can use the Medicae instead. The third and final option in the Elite section is the Charonite Ogryns section. These are 120 points for 3 models and 40 points for extra models as well. So 40 points a model flat. Their move 7, weapon skill 4, BS2, but they don't have a gun. Strength and toughness 5, 3 wounds, initiative 2, 4 attacks, leadership 6, and they've got void armor for the 4+ save. They've got a 5+ feel no pain. They've got rage 2, so they're 6 attacks on the charge. And they got Hammer of Wrath 2 as well with their strength 5, base strength. They come with Charonite Claws, so these are strength 7, AP 3, and Rendon 6. That's a pretty decent profile, but if you've ever used like Galvorbach or things like that, you'll know that it's quite unreliable when fighting against things with a 2+ save, of which there are many in the melee elite world, just Terminators being the obvious one. They've got a rule called Death Frenzy, so anytime they fail a morale check, it counts as passed, but you remove one model from the unit. Now that's quite a big removal, given that that model is a 40-point model, and the rest of the unit gets +1 attack until the end of the turn as a slight upside, so that's pretty cool. Leadership 6, you can't make them run away, but they are going to fail a lot of morale checks and lose extra models, so they will degrade quite quickly once they start taking casualties. They're bulky 4, and they can only be transported in a Dracosan. So the Aurochs and the Aevos Lighter have a rule called Infantry Transport, which means they can only transport infantry, surprisingly. And these guys are monstrous, which most of the changes, the things that monstrous does to the unit don't really matter for these guys. The main one is, though, they can't be pinned, which is a great advantage. Characters can't join them either, but you probably weren't going to put your legate in a unit of Ogryns anyway. There's no assault transports in this army either, which is relevant for these guys because they're obviously an assault unit and they're basically relegated to walking up the board unless you want to buy a Dracosan, which, unfortunately aren't very good. And the last thing is these guys don't benefit from any cohorts. Most of the cohorts benefit tercios, and these guys aren't a tercio. So if you were paying close attention to all those stats I just read out, you will see that these guys are pretty similar to Galvorbach, and that's what I'm going to base this comparison on. Now, the reason I'm doing a comparison is because a lot of the noise online when this book came out was that this unit was not very good. And that, people sort of skipped over this and they said they're not a very good unit. This unit is actually very good. So I'm going to compare it to Galvorbach, which I think we all agree are a great unit, just to give you something to base a comparison off. So these guys have got more attacks. They've got more wounds per point, so they're toughness 5. They're effectively the same defensive profile bar the save and throw. But these guys have got more wounds per point. They got a higher base strength as well when they're in melee with their strength 7 weapon. But they do have a lower weapon skill. They're only initiative 2 and they haven't got murderous strike. So the quality of their attacks is lower. They're also lower morale by a lot. Death Frenzy is a worse version of Corrupted as well. Corrupted on Galvorbach, when you fail a morale, you take D3 wounds. This one's guaranteed to do 3 wounds, although this has got the upside. And this unit doesn't have a Power Fist or ranged options either. Now, that's not the conclusive list. Galvorbach get some other bits like they cause fear and stuff like that as well. We're just focusing on the combat abilities to make this comparison simple. Maths. Let's look at the maths. This is where some of the proof is. So, against marine equivalents, so anything with toughness 4 or and a 3+ save, these guys do 50% more damage than Galvorbach. So if what you want to do is tear Marines apart, these guys are way more efficient per point then Galvorbach are Arit. Now, tearing Marines apart in combat isn't always the reason you take a melee unit, but it is a thing that comes up a lot in the game. It's just needing to take those heavy support squads, tactical support squads, or tactical squads off the board. These guys are fantastic at it. They wound on a 2. They've got more attacks per point. Galvorbach, though, if we're talking about an elite target, so weapon skill 5, a 2+ save as well, and 2 wounds, Galvorbach do about 21% more damage per point. And that's because Galvorbach will murderous strike things sometimes, you know, when they're rolling on a 6, so they do a little bit more damage. Now, that is neither here nor there in the grand scheme of things, because you never know what kind of targets you're going to attack. But as a comparison, the point here is these guys are not just worse Galvorbach. They're 50% better against one common target, and Galvorbach are only 20% better against the other type of target. Thanks to the higher volume of attacks and higher strength, even though they don't have Murderous Strike, these guys also do 25% more damage per point to a Dreadnought, which is, you know, quite a big deal in terms of percentage points. Now, I will say that the absolute numbers that either these guys or Galvorbach do to a Dreadnought, neither of them are very impressive anyway. So again, this is very much math hammer, but the point I am making is these guys are not junk. There are things they are better at. If you're not including Rage or Charging as well, Charonites get even better versus Galvorbach because the Charonites have got, you know, better, worse weapons, and the Galvorbach gain more from their Rage than the Charonites do from their Rage because they've got a higher quality of attacks. So when you're not getting those bonus attacks on either unit, the Charonites are less bad than the Galvorbach in that comparison. So another point in favour of the Charonites. So you do 8% less damage to a Galvorbach unit if you shoot with a bolter. So if you're drilling these guys with bolters, which is a super common way to take wounds off Galvorbach or these, the Galvorbach are going to take 8% less damage. That's mostly because the Galvorbach have got a 3+ save, but they are a bit more expensive per wound. So the Galvorbach have got a tiny advantage, but not as big as it looks because the Charonites are so much cheaper. But when you get hit by high AP weapons, so things like las cannons, where they penetrate your armor and they just roll wounding you, both of these units are exactly the same defensively. So the Charonites actually come out 37.5% more efficient, which is huge. People love shooting Galvorbach with melter guns and las cannons and plasma weapons and that kind of thing to take wounds off them. And Charonites are way tougher, way harder to kill. Galvorbach's biggest disadvantage is if they get focused, they can be taken off the table. And these guys will as well, but they're a lot cheaper while they're doing it. And that also works in melee as well. If you are fighting a Dreadnought, Galvorbach will get torn up by Dreadnoughts like most things will. In exactly the same way, though, these guys are much more efficient in defense there. So I hope that maths has showed you, by comparing them to a great unit, how good these guys actually are. Very comparative to the Galvorbach. I would say they're probably overall a little bit worse. You know, they don't have the fear. They don't have the option to be in a Spartan. Their backup isn't as good because Marines are like a slightly better army than Auxilia. But this is still a really good unit. It functions differently, though. It's great at absorbing the high-end firepower and the high-end melee damage. You know, they're like a tank unit. They're not really a killer unit. They're not going to take out enemy elites. And you probably want to avoid enemy elites unless you're trying to tie them up in combat, which these guys are great at. They're a good tank unit. And if they're bearing down on the enemy, they do have to do something about these, particularly if it's multiple units. And that can give the rest of your army, which are much more fragile, time to go to work and kill things. If the enemy doesn't deal with these, they are going to do damage when they get to combat and tie up the enemy units. They're excellent at killing Marines in particular, which does leave your high volume fire from your riflemen free to shoot other targets. And when they can get to close range to use their Strength 6 blast las rifles, they can be pretty effective against other things while the Ogryns kill Marines. Unfortunately, there's no good way of getting them to combat, so they are going to walk, but again, they are pretty cheap for their toughness, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. You do probably want them in slightly larger units, so if you got like lots of units of 3, every time one dies, it's a morale check, and if you fail it, it's another model dead to death frenzy. You don't really want that to happen. So in units of 5, it means the enemy's got to kill 2 of them to force a morale check and you're only losing 1 out of that unit as opposed to potentially 2 out of 2 separate units if you fail 2 morale checks. And they will fail them because the leadership's 6 and you can't really buff it either. I would highly recommend these in Solar Auxilia armies. I know not everyone thinks Solar Auxilia are a great army. I disagree, and I think this is one of the reasons why. If you are gonna play Solar Auxilia, depending on how you choose to run it, you might go vehicle heavy or something, but like 2 units of 5 of these will be a great role player for the army, really give you some great tactical options. So in summary, for the elite section, the Veletaris are unfortunately quite weak. They're just outclassed by companions so much. You know, there's so much you can do with companions that is the same elite style but better, which is a shame considering the variety that these guys could bring to the army. But if you do want to use them, you can certainly use them a bit more optimally by having a 1-to-1 Storm to Vanguard unit mix. Maybe you could take a couple of units of that or something. And again, that would not be bad. Wouldn't be as maybe optimal as some other things, but it does give you that variety and a bit more of something different to do on the table. The Medicae section, likewise, are pretty good. They're generally very points efficient buy, as long as the units that they're in are, getting shot at, which is probably going to happen for most units. Some model variety in the armies, your medics run around in this massed throng of men, maybe painted a little bit differently, looks pretty cool. And the Charonite Ogryns, I will pick a pronunciation for that at some point, I promise. The Charonite Ogryns are excellent, and they really do give the army a different tactical dimension, and I really think other people who've looked at this book have really slept on these guys, so definitely worth your consideration if you are doing this army. And, models being 40 points each instead of 8 points each is a lot less models to paint too. That's a big bonus. And that's the end of the show. If you've enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe on YouTube, and don't forget to leave me any feedback in the comments below. Also, check out our Discord server, which is linked in the video description as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.